Hi everybody, welcome back. I hope you all are doing well. We today are going to continue our lecture series related to organizational communication, and this particular module and the lectures related to it are going to focus more on group development as opposed to the overall organizational structure and how an organization might work. So we're going to focus on a little bit of a different aspect of organizational communication, and that's really how do we develop effective groups. And an organization, depending on how you think about it and define it, is just a really large group, or you can think about it as a series of subgroups, and those different subgroups in different departments, different offices, different locations tend to function as their own individual group with some input, some rules, some norms, some ways of handling business or guidelines for anything related to the group that come through the organization from leadership, which we've talked about. So today we're really thinking more about developing groups, and we're going to move into how do we develop teams and teamwork. But to start, we have to start thinking about groups as systems. This is really important, and it's one of the things that I think is very interesting about organizational and group communication, is that we can think about this as a living, breathing thing, as a system. There's all sorts of different things that come into play. So when we're thinking about that, we're going to start with a little brief discussion question where I'll ask you to just pause the video, take a second, jot down some ideas, and then come back to it. We'll then define a system. We'll talk about how to deal with some challenges. We'll talk about boundary control, which is an interesting kind of element to group and organizational communication. We'll talk about group size, and then we will review. So to start, read through the discussion question here, pause the video, take a few minutes to respond. But what I would like for you to do is think of a group that you're involved with and that you know extremely well. It can be any kind of group, from a team to a work group, family group, an organization. It can be a variety of different things. I want you to write down what type of group that is. So is it a primary group, which is your family group, for example? A task group, like a work group at your job, a social group, like your friends. Think about the type of group that you are involved in, and then list out the key factors that you think might relate to how well that group functions. And right now, you're just kind of brainstorming. So just think about some of the key elements to making that group function effectively or ineffectively. Once you've done that, come back and we will continue on with the lecture. Okay, so when we're thinking about a system, we have to define it so that we can get a clear understanding of what it is that we're talking about. I really like this definition, and that is that a system is a set of interconnected parts working together to form a whole in the context of a changing environment. So the key elements here start with input. It is a system of interconnected parts working together to form a whole in the context of a changing environment. So when we're thinking about interconnectedness, when we're thinking about working together to form a whole, thinking about a changing environment, we have to think about input. And we'll explain a little bit more about what that means. We then have to think about throughput, which is essentially how we're processing information, how we're processing that input in the group. And then lastly, we have output. And one of the key elements to this definition specifically is this idea of interconnectedness, which we're going to come back to here in just a few minutes. So when we're thinking about input, this is a key element of systems theory, and we have to think about anything that consists of resources that come from outside the system, such as energy, information, people, and environmental influences that directly impact the system and how that system functions. So quite simply, input is anything that's coming from outside of the group, outside of the team, outside of the organization, and then entering into the group. That can be resources, that can be information, that can be people, that can be anything. So anything that's coming from outside of the group, any resources, anything that's coming from outside of the group that is entering the group or the organization, that is considered input, or can be considered input. So just quite simply think about it, anything entering into the group, team, or organization. Now throughput is really quite simply, it's the process of transforming that input, again anything that's entering the group, into output to keep the system functioning. So think about anything entering the system and entering the group, entering the organization. We have to process that information. We have to process those resources. We then do that, and that's called throughput. So it's our process of transforming input into output. Really simple. The last element here is output, and this is the final product. This is the thing that results from that input, from that processing in the throughput stage, and our output is our final product. It's the thing that comes out of that. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be good or bad, right? It can be a work in progress. We could spend a certain amount of time working on something, processing some information, working in our task groups, working in our class groups, working in our work groups, and maybe not get to our final product, but we're working through that information, and then we have a certain amount of output. Now, this is where things can get a little bit tricky, because depending on the group, depending on the organization, we might have deadlines, we might have certain things that we have to do, we might have time restraints, and this is really where we start thinking about the role and impact of leadership, the role and impact of communication networks within the group, within the organization. So it's super important that we're thinking about all of the elements that can impact the final product, right? And most of those things come down to input. So really simply, when we're thinking about groups or organizations as systems, we have to be able to identify input, throughput, and output. Super simple concepts there. Of course, output can be decisions, solutions to problems, really anything that comes from the group. Now, I said in the definition that that one of the key ideas here was interconnectedness, and this is super important. So this is a key factor of any group or system, and that is that the parts are impacted by one another. So we are not really in a group, we're not really in a system if my actions or lack of actions don't impact you. So we have to have this relationship where what you do impacts me, what I do impacts you, and everybody else within the group, everybody else within the organization. And again, that's where we have to start thinking about the roles of leadership, the roles of influence, the roles of power within the group, within the organization. Because when we have interconnectedness, when we have positions of higher authority, of more influence, we have a greater impact over the organization, over the group. When we have less power or perceived power, when we have less influence, then we don't have as much control, we don't have as much of an impact, but we are still interconnected. So think about this in a way that gets us away from centering leadership, because the people lower in the organizational hierarchy, the people that are maybe newer to the group, depending on the type of group, may not feel this interconnectedness, may not have that interconnectedness, but there is still some ability to impact each other. So just for example, right, if I enter into a work group and I really quickly find out that I don't like the job, I'm not getting along with the people that I'm working with, I don't like the organization now that I'm within it, and I use one of those dissent strategies to resist the power, to resist the influence, and I'm really just biding my time until I can find a different job, that's going to negatively impact the group. So just for example, I used to work at Starbucks, and there were lots of people coming and going. There was pretty high turnover, and when we had new people coming in and more established people leaving, and we had that high turnover, it negatively impacted the overall feeling of the group because we felt less interconnected. We felt like we weren't really part of a group, like we weren't really part of a team. Now, fortunately, the store manager took some steps to correct that, but interconnectedness is a key element of a group. We have to have some kind of influence on each other in order for that group to function. Now, we don't just want to have negative influence, we want to have positive influence, and this term synergy is a major buzzword in the business world and in organizational communication. But when we're thinking about synergy, we have to be thinking about something that occurs when group performance from joint action of members exceeds expectations based on perceived abilities and skills of individual members. Quite simply, what this means is that we have synergy when the group is achieving something that any individual couldn't achieve. So we have synergy when we are achieving something that highlights all of our abilities, it exceeds our expectations, our output is beyond what we were looking for. It's beyond what any one individual member of the group or organization could achieve. Now, it's not always going to be as easy to highlight as that final product, right? Because we might have a final product that we might have some output that could not be achieved by any one individual, but it took us a really long time to get there. We had a lot of conflict. We weren't making good decisions. Well, we could still say, that based on this definition, that we have synergy, but maybe not as much as we want. So we want to think about producing synergy in three primary ways. Number one is that we have to get and create motivation within our groups. We can hire people that are highly motivated, but we can also create motivation in our group, which is part of what we're going to talk about through this series of lectures on developing teamwork, because that's a really important aspect. We have to make sure that people have equal participation. So one of the things that will ruin synergy really quickly is the idea that one or multiple people are doing more work than somebody else. So we have to be really aware of that. And then we have to be thinking about diversity. Now, diversity is a really important aspect of any group, of any organization. This is a very well-researched, well-supported concept that has been gaining more attention recently in our public discourse. But for those people that study group communication, that study organizational communication, this is nothing new. In order to have a well-functioning group, you have to have a variety of perspectives from within that group. You have to have diversity within that group, and that's a key element to developing synergy, to developing a group that works well, to developing a system that works well, and ultimately to having a functional organization. So that's going to be one element that we'll continue to talk about over the next few weeks. But it's important to note that a key element of synergy is having a diverse workforce, having different perspectives that you can pull from, different skill sets, different ideas, and different ways of viewing the world to improve the way that our organization is functioning. But we're always going to have some challenges, right? When we're thinking about having diverse perspectives, when we're thinking about bringing people in and making sure everybody's participating and developing motivation and processing or using our throughput to create synergy, and we have that interconnectedness, we're going to have some issues. It's inevitable because human beings, we're challenging, right? So we have 5 things here that we can do to try and limit our group member challenges, our issues. Number 1 is to focus on cooperation and not competition between group members. We do not want to be pinning the people that work together against one another. We want them working together to complete a project, not working against each other and creating this individualistic kind of idea. This is a major thing that comes up in most groups and most organizations, especially when we're highlighting individual success rather than group success. And again, we're going to talk more about this, but we have to really focus on cooperation and developing cooperation. Number 2 is developing a clear code of conduct. Almost any group, almost any major organization will have some clear code of conduct, some way for managing different situations. And depending on the size of the group, the size of the organization, this might be developed by that group, or it might be passed down by a group with a greater degree of influence. So say, for example, you're in a class and you develop a code of conduct, the class would develop that. If you enter into a major corporation, you're going to have laws, rules, and regulations that are going to guide what you do. But having a clear code of conduct, again, is really important for managing member challenges. Number 3 is we have to be comfortable being dynamic in the way that we communicate, and our communication styles, our communication patterns, changing the way that we communicate to better interact with the people around us. And that's super important, because if we are very rigid in our communication patterns, we can actually lead to more conflict and less effective decision making. Number 4 is confront the person who's creating the problem in a non-confrontational manner. This can be challenging, but if you have a clear code of conduct, you have rules, you have a way of processing, a way of managing those challenges, of communicating in a non-confrontational manner, this can be really effective. And number 5, of course, is remove the person from the group. But hopefully we don't have that particular thing happening too much. Too much turnover, too many people entering and leaving a system creates disturbance, it creates challenges, it makes the group and organization work less effectively. So we have to really be thinking about how do we make sure that we have people in our group that are working with us and that are highly motivated, they want to participate, and we still develop and we have a very diverse group. We do that by having some boundary controls. Now this might seem a little bit odd, but we have to determine who is entering and joining and leaving the group. We have to limit input for a variety of reasons, but one of them is that the size of the group, the size of the organization matters. If we have too much input of anything, right, it can cause a system to malfunction and to break down. So just quite simply think about it like your body is a system. If you are consuming too much sugar, you damage your system, and that damages the way that your body functions. So we have to have some boundary controls. We have to limit what we eat, how much sugar we consume. Think about that as a group, right? We have to limit how many people, how much input is entering our system so that we can have a functioning, well-oiled system that is going to work really well. So boundary control is really important, and we're thinking about boundary control. A key aspect of this is openness, and this refers to the degree of continuous interchange with the outside environment. So if we have a lot of openness, people are coming and going, joining and leaving the group really quickly, really rapidly. There's lots of input entering the system. The system is then having to process that through the throughput stage and then have some kind of output. If we have less openness, we have less input entering the system, we have fewer people entering and leaving the system. So just really quickly, we have a variety of different types of boundary control, and this is just to get you thinking about some of the ways that we limit input. But number one is physical barriers. We love physical barriers, right? You can think about cubicles in an office space. You can think about an actual office space. You can think about neighborhoods. You can think about entering someplace that has more security. That means they have less openness, right? So physical barriers are one type of boundary control. Second type, we have psychological barriers. So this is where we have to think about how are we thinking about input from a psychological standpoint? How are we thinking about people's well-being, their mental health as they enter or leave a system? Linguistic barriers, we can have jargon, we can have codes, we can have terminology that identifies somebody as being part of a group. You can even think about different slang terms as being linguistic barriers. We have actual rules set forth for who can enter and exit the organization and at what point. We have different roles, so we have leaders, we have people in HR, we have people in sales, we have people in manufacturing, we have people in distribution. Right? We have different roles, and each one of those roles has a different aspect, controls a different part of the organization or the group, and in order to fill those roles, we only have so many, right? We can't just have everybody who wants to do this thing doing this thing, because then the system will break down. So we have to have certain roles and find people to fill those roles. And then, of course, as you already know, communication networks. These are so important for developing boundary controls and for limiting input, managing our throughput, and creating high-quality outputs. Now, I told you that the size of the group matters, and this is really important because the larger the group, we have an exponential increase in the complexity of the communication within that group. So if we look at a really simple group, we have 2 group members, 2 people, we have 2 possible interactions. If we have 5 group members, we have 75 possible interactions. If we have 8 group members, we have 1,056 possible interactions. So an 8-member group is pretty small. We would consider that, again, depending on the definition, a small group. So when we're thinking about organizations, when you have hundreds and thousands of people, you have to manage all of those interactions, and you have to focus that system, you have to focus those interactions, focus that communication through the use of communication networks, through the use of boundary controls, so that your group can function effectively, so that you can manage input, you can process it in throughput, you can create a high quality output, and you can create synergy and have that interconnectedness. So some of the disadvantages of a large group are, number one, there are more people who are not going to participate, which is going to negatively impact our synergy. Number two is we're going to have more dissatisfaction. People are going to feel less connected. We're going to have less interconnectedness within the group. Number three, we're going to have less cooperation. So people aren't going to be working together as much. We're going to end up having more competition, which negatively impacts our synergy and our overall outcome or our output. Number four, less satisfaction. So if we have more dissatisfaction, we clearly have less satisfaction. We have more formality that is required. And again, that's where those communication networks come into play. You can't have an organization of 1,000 people with no boundary controls, with no rules, with no norms for how to communicate, because it would be absolute chaos. Nothing would get done. So we have to be thinking about using boundary controls to improve our synergy and improve the way that we are working as a group. So in review, we touched on a number of different things. We will elaborate on these things through the next series of lectures, but we have the discussion question, so keep that close by. We defined what a system is. We talked about how we can deal with some different challenges, talked about the all-important boundary control and openness. We talked about group size, and then of course we are reviewing. So as we're thinking about groups, thinking about organizations, I really encourage you to start thinking about these things as living, breathing systems, things that are impacted by a variety of different things. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. You can comment, you can email me, but make sure that you think about your groups in different ways and then watch the next couple of lectures so we can really build on these ideas.